Hello everyone, I am KM Weiland, and welcome to this week's writing Q&A question. So this week's question is from Andy Clark, who asks, I'm wondering if you have any tips for determining if your story is likely too big. I'm looking at this from a short story perspective, but it can be a consideration for a novel as well. Lord of the Rings in 200 pages wouldn't have worked. So I think this is a really good question, and one that sooner or later we all ask, because most of us tend to either underwrite or, I'll raise my hand here, overwrite. And so at a certain point we have to, ask ourselves, what are we trying to convey and what's the best way to do this? What's best going to serve the story? And ultimately this is a super subjective question because it really does depend on the genre you're writing, on your intentions for the story, on the story itself, and its scope and what you want to convey, how much you want to convey through subtext versus context, stuff like this. So really it's a very, very personal question that each author has to get real with themselves about in order to determine what feels right for them. However, there are a few guidelines, kind of questions that you can ask yourself to help you determine what is best for your story. And particularly if perhaps you're trying to make a story too big, when it would be better told in a smaller way. Now, specifically here, I'm talking about a big story in the sense of one that has lots of scope, and it's just, there's a lot there. If we think of Lord of the Rings, that's a good example. But necessarily, if we're talking about big stories, usually we're also talking about stories that are long. So if you're interested in this question because you're wondering how long your word count should be, considerations there will, you can look to like genre guidelines and things like that to help you decide. But these questions about how big your novel should be will also help you determine how long perhaps is the optimal length for it. Okay, so I have four little guidelines for you here. And the first question to ask yourself when you're trying to determine how big your story should be is how much explaining are you going to have to do in this story? And specifically by that, I'm talking about stories in which readers aren't necessarily familiar with some of the elements. And this can be true in speculative fiction, such as fantasy or science fiction, where the author is making up all this stuff, and therefore he's introducing it to the readers for the first time. And there's a certain level of explanation that has to be shared in order for readers to be able to get it and feel like they understand the world of the story and the characters' motivations within it. Historical stories and other stories that readers may enter into at some level and in some instances actually wanting to be educated by the story. They want to learn something about a historical period, or perhaps it's a very specialized job place or a different country than what most of the readers might be living in themselves. Things like that. If it's a story where there's a certain amount of education that you have to offer readers, that is necessarily going to mean that there's more exploring within the story that you have to do to convey that. And this is especially true when you realize that most of this explanation you're going to want to be showing or dramatizing rather than telling or summarizing for readers. And as we've talked about in a previous video, the more you dramatize or show, the longer your word count is going to be. So if you are writing a story where you feel like there is a good deal of explanation that has to happen in order to keep readers up to speed, that's going to influence how big your finished story will be. Now, a second consideration is how much time does your story cover? And this is not a hard and fast rule, as none of these are, that a story should be long or should be short. But generally speaking, if you are covering a huge expanse of time in a story, that's an indication of the bigness of your story, and therefore at least a reason why you might be able to consider expanding it into something a little bigger than it might be otherwise. If you're telling a story that happens, in a week or a couple days, or even just a couple months sometimes, that's a pretty fast timeline and isn't something that's necessarily going to be served by a really big story that expands everything and makes it seem like, like a lot of time has passed. Now, there are exceptions to this. Obviously, extremely weighty things can happen in very short amounts of time, so you kind of have to weigh that out. And that brings me to number 3, which is how weighty is this story? So if you're writing, just kind of a fun popcorn type of story that your readers are going to be engaging with primarily for entertainment or just because they want to pick something up, usually they're going to want something pretty fast in those instances of beach read. Again, not a hard and fast rule, but if you are, really wanting to go deep with something and explore the depth of it and the weight of it, that too is an indication that maybe this is a story that can go really big. Lord of the Rings, again, a good example of something that just couldn't have gotten across the power of what it was trying to convey if it had been told in a more condensed form. And finally, number 4, you want to consider how many pieces are in this story. And by that I mean how many characters, how many settings, things like that. Just how many moving parts do you have in this story? Because the more moving parts you have, the bigger the story is going to get. Now, again, you have to kind of weigh this out because just because it's convenient or because you want there to be lots of characters or settings or magical rules within your story, whatever the case may be, that doesn't mean that it should be in your story or that it best serves your story. But some stories need that. Some stories need that in order to convey the scope, the weight of what you're trying to get across. If you're telling a story about a character who's traveling the world, the whole point of the story is that he's traveling, that he's seeing many different places, meeting many different people. And that in itself can create that sense of bigness. Now, you can convey that in a very short story by allowing most of that to remain subtext, but it is a opportunity to go bigger and to explore that in more depth by dramatizing those episodes if that's something that feels right for you in your story. So those are 4 considerations for whether or not your particular story is best served by going big. Now, a few caveats and sort of the bottom line on determining how to judge those 4 criteria. And the first one is simply you have to look at your story. What is your plot? How is the plot being structured? How is the character arc tying in with that? How is the theme being presented via that meeting of plot and character? And what are you trying to convey via these things? Because that's your story. So everything has to be weighed against that. All of the other fun stuff like settings and if you're writing a fantasy, your exciting rules for your magical system, stuff like that. All of that stuff that we as writers fall in love with and that readers too enjoy, all of that has to be weighed against the needs of the story. So always come back to that. What is serving the plot? What is serving the character development? What is this new element saying in regards to the story's theme that you're trying to convey? And weighing all of that against it. Because it's important to remember, bigger books are not better than short stories. Both can be extremely potent and extremely powerful. And it's just a matter of figuring out, what's best going to serve the vision that you have for the underlying kind of message of this story and the shape of it and how that's going to be presented to your readers and your audience. And related to this, the second kind of litmus test for how big your story should be is simply keeping an eye on your tendency towards self-indulgence, because as writers, we all have this. We're in love with our stories, we're in love with our words, and we want to share everything. I think people who put a lot of work into the behind the scenes of the story, for instance, if you're again, world building for a fantasy story, or you've done a ton of research for a historical story or something in that vein, you want to share it. It's like it's good stuff and it's great, and you really want to be able to give it all to readers, share all the treasure with readers. And that's great. And in some stories that can be like the best part of the book. But in many stories, it's overkill. It doesn't serve the story. It drags out the word count unnecessarily. And it's just self-indulgent. It's not serving the story, and therefore it's not serving the reader. So really all it's serving is the author. So it's always a good thing to just get really clear on how can you best serve the story, and then clearing out, all the other stuff, putting it in your deleted data folder so it's not gone forever. And you may use it again in a future story. And it can also inform the subtext of something that may turn out being much shorter or smaller than you originally thought, but still packs that powerful punch. So again, no hard and fast rule here. This is super subjective to the writer, to their vision for the story, and to the story itself. So you really have to weigh what feels right, what feels best for your story. But hopefully some of these criteria can help you make those choices and see where you're adding unnecessarily to the story, or where the story would be served by going bigger and allowing it to have that extra context within this world of your story that you're creating. So I hope that's helpful. If you have another question, please leave it down below in the questions and I will answer one of them in a future video. If you'd like to keep in touch with me and all the content I produce, whether it's these videos or my weekly post and podcast on my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com, the best way to do that is by joining my mailing list at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com/mailing list. And you can also join me on Instagram at author KM Weiland. And I'll see you again next week.